Leading women's rights advocate and expert from Iran, Sussan Tahmasebi, speaks to us about the latest events in Iran. As we mentioned, reports of arson to the home of the spiritual founder, Ayatollah Khomeini. And we hear that an activist network has sent footage recorded of this alleged incident. Very good evening to you, Sussan. Thank you so much for speaking to us. What are you hearing? We understand the authorities have denied that this has occurred at all. What are your networks saying?
Well, of course, the news spread, and it was very unexpected because it's a conservative city, and a conservative city that has never taken a step like this to so publicly speak up against the founder of the Islamic Republic. So it was a lot of news coverage, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of news coverage to the contrary within the country, and I think it hasn't been proven one way or the other to the satisfaction of observers outside, at least. But I think what's really much more important than that is the ongoing protests and the level of incredible violence that has been used against protesters over the last couple of days.
The symbolic significance, I'd imagine, not lost to those who were participating or who are critical of the actions. What is your interpretation of these latest events?
Well, I mean, yes, of course, it has symbolic repercussions, and it has more than symbolic repercussions. This is what people have been yelling and screaming in the streets for a couple of months now, that while these protests started out in demanding justice for Mahsa Jina Amini, who was killed in custody of the morality police, and the demand for the overturning of the mandatory hijab laws, it has now very quickly turned into much broader demands that, where people are asking for fundamental freedoms and for serious political change. And many people are asking for the Islamic regime, the end to the Islamic regime. So it's symbolic, but it's not anything new, because people in these protests have been demanding this change for some time, and they clearly see themselves as opposed to this regime, many of them. I don't want to speak on behalf of all of them, but I think what we're seeing predominantly is that people are asking for serious political change. So while it has symbolic repercussions or symbolic, implications, but it's what people have been demanding in the streets for a couple of months very loudly and getting killed for it. And so, I should mention that there...
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to mention about the protests. So we had, there were protests across the country, but particularly in the Kurdish regions yesterday, in West Azerbaijan, and also in cities in Kurdistan province, West Azerbaijan province, and Kurdistan province. And the video footage that we see from these cities is actually very horrific. These cities have been turned into virtual war zones. People have taken to the streets. Women are sitting on the streets in some of the videos that we see. And in other videos, we see that people have created trenches. They've put pots and pans and other metal shields on their heads to protect them from bullet wounds that are being used to kill protesters. And we had a pretty horrific and very intense protests in the city of Mahabad, where protesters were targeted and attacked. And just in the last 4 or 5 days, over 27 people have been killed in Kurdish areas, in the Kurdistan province and in West Azerbaijan province. So I really want to I think it's important to bring attention to the incredible level of violence that's being used against largely peaceful protesters who are unarmed, who are only giving slogans, and they have, their collective power. They're in the streets, but they're not using violence, but they're being killed ruthlessly.
And, just in terms of what we were speaking about, the symbolism earlier on, and also reflecting on the latest incidents, it was couched around the spiritual value of Ali Khomeini's birth home being torched. And you were talking about the greater freedoms and how Mahsa Amini's death has brought to the fore a lot of these grievances. Nobody would have really thought that these protests would have lasted this long, especially given the crackdowns from the early onset. What more do you think is likely to happen? And I'm talking also about the political reforms that are being sought. Do you anticipate the situation getting worse before it gets better, if at all?
Listen, so people are done with the reformers and they're done with the conservatives for some time. And I'll say that a lot of people voted and participated in the reform process over the last 20 years. But the reform process failed to respond to the demands of people. And unfortunately, many reformers also failed to truly respond to the demands of the people. And we see, that they're all embroiled in this internal political fight. And they see people, the reformers kind of see people as their foot soldiers, so they can come in to help them win their political fight. And the conservatives they have their own backing. I think that they're much more respectful of the people that support them, the ultra conservatives that support them, but they see regular people as disposable, as we see very clearly in these protests. So I don't foresee any reforms being offered, and I'm not even sure if people really want those reforms. I think the opportunity for that has passed. I don't want to speculate about what's going to happen in the future. Certainly, I think when these protests started in the initial phases, many of us thought that they would be crushed immediately, but they have continued because people are angry and they keep getting angrier and angrier. You talk about symbolism. There are a lot of there's much more symbolic issues than the torching of the house of the founder of the Islamic Republic. For example, people are mourning their dead. Over 480 people have been killed in these protests in just a couple months that we know of, that's been documented. And every time there's a funeral, people gather in the Islamic tradition. They gather, they mourn on the day of the burial, then the third day and the 40th day. And every time that they gather to mourn, the mournings turn into a protest because people are outraged by the killing with impunity of ordinary citizens and the violence that they have faced, this indiscriminate violence that they have faced. And then, security forces come in and then they kill another person. So this is happening. I think that's much more important symbolic issue, that people are not being allowed to mourn and then they're getting killed while mourning. I think this is much more symbolic than and much more important. And so we had people killed over the last couple of days in these mourning ceremonies. For example, in Shiraz, we had a young man who was killed by the name of Sajjad Qaemi. And also we've had a lot of children, over 55 children have been killed, some as young as 7. The last child who was killed, the story is absolutely horrific. In the city of Ize, was traveling in a car with his family, and they were going forward and the roads were closed, and the guards told them to turn back. And this poor child tells his father, listen to the police this time, we should trust them. And the car turns back and they riddle the car with gunfire. And this poor kid gets killed. He's a 9-year-old kid by the name of Kian Pir Falak. And this has really outraged people, unbelievably outraged people. And so his mother actually spoke about this incident and talked about what had happened on the day that he was killed. And I should mention that the people who shot at him were Iranian security forces, and their base was at the Iranian Red Crescent. Can you imagine that? Isn't that the upside down of the epitome of symbolic irony, right? And they themselves took him to the hospital, but unfortunately he died. Then after she told this story at his funeral, they brought her in, they arrested her and forced her into a false confession where she denied everything. So I think it's important for the world to see the incredible level of violence and the incredible level of deceit that the Iranian government is engaged in response to these protests.
Thank you.